I was still halfway through my sandwich when I saw it, my vintage Airstream camper being yanked off my land by a tow truck I'd never called. No warning, no notice, not even a note. Just tire marks slicing through the gravel like a knife through trust. And right there, standing with arms crossed and sunglasses perched like she was about to model for a dictatorship calendar, was HOA President Karen Dillingham, sipping iced tea from a cup that said, Queen of Compliance. That camper wasn't just a weekend retreat. It was my late grandfather's last big project. She towed a memory. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just going to be a complaint to the sheriff. This was war. The quiet edges of Pinebrook had always felt a bit too curated for my taste. Rows of identical beige homes with identical garden gnomes and rules longer than a tax code. But I didn't live in Pinebrook. I lived beside it. My property stretched 5 acres wide, forested, natural, and entirely outside HOA jurisdiction. A legal detail Karen either didn't understand or refused to acknowledge. Probably the second one, judging by her behavior. I wasn't the kind of guy who went looking for trouble. But trouble, it seemed, liked walking over from across the street with a clipboard and a superiority complex. My camper sat maybe 20 feet from the fence line, backed up near a row of pine trees. It was silver, polished, and lovingly restored by me and my cousin Lou over the course of 2 years. We'd pulled it out of my grandfather's old barn after he passed and turned it into something between a mobile cabin and a time capsule. Inside were hand-stitched curtains from my grandma's sewing kit, a photo of Grandpa in his ranger uniform, and the original pull-out couch he refused to replace because it still had character. It was more than just a camper. It was home, heritage, and hobby rolled into one shiny shell. A week before the incident, Karen had approached me like a prosecutor preparing for trial. She stood just past the property line and barked over the split-rail fence. "That trailer is an eyesore," she said, practically trembling with righteous fury. "It violates at least 3 of our HOA's aesthetic standards." I tilted my hat back and kept digging post holes for my garden fence. "Karen, I'm not in your HOA." She scowled. "You're adjacent." "Adjacent ain't under jurisdiction." That conversation ended with her storming off, huffing about how the neighborhood deserves better. I thought it was over. But Karen wasn't the kind of person who accepted boundaries, especially the physical or legal kind. The day my camper vanished, I was out picking up fencing supplies. When I came back, all I found was a patch of scuffed earth, some tire grooves, and my motion sensor light swinging side to side like it had just witnessed a crime and didn't know how to process the trauma. My first thought was theft, until my neighbor Terry texted me a video from his Ring doorbell. "Hey Jake, thought you'd want to see this." The footage showed a tow truck backing into my property like it owned the place. Karen was right behind it, arms folded, directing the driver like she was orchestrating a construction project. There was no hesitation, no confusion. She wanted it gone and made it happen. The worst part? She smiled when the wheels lifted off the ground. I stood there staring at the video, pulse ticking like a time bomb. Not only was that a trespass, it was a theft. And I had video evidence with her front and center. I called the sheriff's department, heart still pounding. But the deputy who showed up was fresh out of the academy and about as effective as a plastic fork in a steakhouse. He listened, nodded, and then said the words that made my jaw tighten. "Sounds like a civil dispute. She entered my property without permission and removed personal property," I argued. "How's that not criminal? She claims it was blocking HOA access. Says there's a utility easement." "There's no easement," I snapped. "This isn't even HOA land." He scratched his neck and said he'd file a report. But I could tell from his tone nothing was going to happen fast. I watched the squad car drive away with my complaint sitting on the passenger seat like an unpaid bill. That's when I turned to the one thing that had never let me down, proof. I had set up a trail cam years ago to monitor deer and coyotes. It was now repositioned closer to the fence where the camper had been. Pulling the footage confirmed what I'd already seen. Karen waving the truck in, guiding it to back up, nodding as the driver hooked the winch to the underframe. She didn't just call for removal. She choreographed it. But I didn't lash out. I didn't storm into the HOA office or plaster posters around town. I did what my granddad always taught me: handle fire with precision, not panic. I went down to the county clerk's office and asked for parcel map. Turns out, not only was my property fully outside the HOA, but the gate they built years ago? It extended 7 feet over my land. 7 illegal feet of wrought iron arrogance. The next step was the tow yard. The guy behind the counter was chewing gum and watching an old sitcom when I walked in. "You tow an Airstream from Ridgewood Lane today?" I asked. He looked up. "Yeah, had orders from a homeowner association." "Who signed it?" He pulled out a clipboard and flipped through the carbon copies. "Some lady. Dillingham? Paid cash. Said it was a community issue." I showed him a printout of my parcel map and pointed to the line. "That camper was on private land, off-grid, not HOA property. You just committed theft." His face went pale. "She said she was authorized." "She lied." He sputtered some excuse about being misled, that they'd return it once I paid the impound fee. I left with a copy of the authorization form, Karen's signature scrawled across the top like a royal decree. That was all I needed. I stood in my driveway that evening, staring at the empty space where the camper once sat, and breathed slow. My cousin Lou pulled up in his rusty pickup. "I heard what happened," he said, stepping out. "They took it," I said simply. "Karen took it." Lou didn't respond at first. He just stared across the fence at the HOA gate, fancy, black, polished with gold accents. "You know," he said finally, "I've got that old tow rig sitting behind the barn. Still works. We used it to pull out a sunken cattle trailer last year." I turned to him slowly, eyebrow raised. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he grinned. "I'm not thinking yet," I replied. "But I'm starting to feel something." That night, I sketched out a plan with precision. No shouting, no chaos, just the sweet hum of gears, the stretch of a winch cable, and the groan of steel meeting consequences. Karen had overstepped. She trespassed, stole, and lied. And she was about to learn that some fences weren't just for decoration. Some fences could pull back. The next morning, I woke up with one thought burning in my mind: paperwork. If Karen wanted to play a game of rules, then I'd beat her at her own game. No shouting matches. No neighborhood theatric. Just cold, hard proof. The kind that turns smug smiles into legal panic. I packed up my documents and drove down to the county clerk's office in town, a quiet building that smelled like faded ink and dusty manila folders. The woman behind the counter, Dolores, had been there since the dawn of time, or at least since fax machines were the height of technology. She knew the layout of the property records better than most people know their kitchen drawers. When I slid my ID across the counter and asked for property line documents and easement filings for parcel 198B, she nodded without looking up and shuffled to the back with the speed of someone on their fourth coffee. 10 minutes later, I had a full printout of my property borders, stamped and certified. There it was, in black and white. My land ended just inches before the fence. Karen's fancy HOA gate? It protruded past the official border by 7 feet. 7 feet of ornamental nonsense installed years ago without legal clearance. That gate wasn't just on my property, it was sitting on it like it owned the place. My camper had been 20 feet back. I had buffer room to spare, and still, she dragged it away like a bag of trash. I asked Dolores if there had ever been an easement or right-of-way granted to Pinebrook HOA on my parcel. She checked twice, shook her head, and said flatly, "Nope. That's your land, honey. No one else has rights over it." I walked out of the clerk's office holding what I now considered Exhibit A in what was about to become the HOA showdown of the year. But I wasn't done. I drove straight to the tow yard again. This time, I came with legal paperwork and attitude. The same gum-chewing guy from before straightened up a little when he saw me. I handed him the certified map. This is the property you towed from. You still think she had the right? He swallowed hard. Look, man, I don't make the rules, I just. You broke them, I cut in. You towed from private property based on false authority. That makes you and your company liable. He muttered something about getting the manager. A few minutes later, a gruff guy in a flannel shirt emerged and asked me to come into the office. I showed him the parcel map, the ring footage from Terry, and Karen's signed authorization. His face turned into a combination of concern and quiet swearing. She paid in cash, he admitted. Said she was HOA president and had jurisdiction. She doesn't. She never did. He rubbed his temple and sighed. You want the camper back? I want it back without paying a penny. And I want an invoice printed showing Karen Dillingham as the person who authorized the tow. He nodded slowly. That I can do. By the end of the day, my camper was scheduled to be returned the following morning. But I wasn't finished yet. Karen thought she could bulldoze over me with her title and taste for control, but she didn't count on one crucial thing. I don't get mad. I get meticulous. I headed back home and walked the perimeter of my property with a marker flag in one hand and the parcel map in the other. Every 7 feet of encroachment from the HOA gate was now officially flagged. I placed a small sign at the base of the gatepost that read, Private property line, no trespassing, evidence recorded. And just to drive the point home, I mounted a trail cam directly across from it. That camera had already caught Karen in the act once. Now it was on round-the-clock patrol. Later that night, Lou stopped by again, this time with a thermos full of coffee and a grin that said he had an idea. He motioned toward the gate and asked, You thinking about doing something about that monstrosity? Thinking? I said. I'm blueprinting. We walked out back where he kept his old tow rig stored under a shed. It was a Frankenstein of a machine, part snowplow, part heavy-duty winch, and part lawnmower engine. But it ran. It could pull a tree stump from the ground without flinching. And best of all, it was small enough to maneuver right up to the fence. Lou popped the hood and grinned. Still thinkin'? I looked at the rig, then back at the fence, and smiled. I'm imagining. By the next day, the camper was returned to me. Slightly dusty, but otherwise unharmed. I parked it even farther back from the property line, just to emphasize the ridiculousness of the whole situation. As the tow truck driver was backing out, Karen stepped outside and stood with her arms folded. Her mouth opened, probably to say something self-righteous, but I cut her off with a raised hand and one sentence. Tow my property again and I'll be towing back. She scoffed. You're threatening me? Nope, I said. I'm warning you. Legally. That afternoon, I started prepping the winch rig. Lou helped me reinforce the hooks and test the pull strength. We anchored the frame to a series of weighted barrels to keep it from rolling. The idea wasn't to destroy anything recklessly. It was to remove a structure that had no business being there. My logic was simple. If they could tow my camper from legally protected land, then I could tow their gate off of a legally occupied space. 2 wrongs don't make a right, but 2 pulls might balance the scale. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. She started rallying her HOA board members and knocking on doors, painting me as an unhinged neighbor with a vendetta. I overheard bits and pieces from neighbors walking by, things like, he's trying to destroy our entrance and he might be dangerous. I didn't respond. I just made sure my paperwork was airtight, my video footage backed up, and my equipment ready to go. One evening, while tightening bolts on the tow rig, I noticed a group of HOA board members gathered at the end of the cul-de-sac. Karen stood in the middle like a general surveying a battlefield. I waved at them with a smile that probably made her blood boil. She marched up, this time with a man in khakis and a camera phone. Probably some kind of HOA compliance officer she drafted last minute. We're documenting this, she said. We believe your equipment poses a safety risk to our gate. I pointed to the line of orange flags leading up to the gate. Everything on this side of those flags is my land. What I do here is my business." The man with the phone muttered something about liability and lawsuit. I pointed to my camera and said, "Great. Let's let the footage show who's in violation. You know, just like the last time." Karen looked like she wanted to melt me with her stare. But for all her fury, she couldn't argue with the facts. That's the funny thing about people who weaponize rules. They're never prepared when someone knows them better. As she turned and walked away, I heard her hiss under her breath, "He's just trying to make a scene." Oh no, I thought. Not a scene. A statement. That night, as the sun dipped behind the treeline and the frogs started singing their nightly chorus, I stood beside my camper, now safely parked, and looked out at the fence. It was no longer just a decorative entrance for a self-important community. It was a symbol of a line crossed. And soon I was going to pull it back, inch by satisfying inch. Not in anger. Not in haste. But with quiet, calculated resolve. Because in Pinebrook, fences made neighbors. But when HOA egos turned those fences into weapons, sometimes the only thing to do was hook up a winch and tow a little justice their way. The following Sunday began with a sunrise so calm it almost convinced me to call the whole thing off. Birds chirped with perfect rhythm, the sky was painted in lazy pinks, and even the HOA gate looked almost picturesque in the early light. But I wasn't fooled. That gate, all polished metal and smug symmetry, represented the nerve Karen had to violate my land, disrespect my family's legacy, and parade her authority like a badge she'd never earned. That calm morning wasn't a sign to let it go. It was the perfect stage for what I had planned. Every bolt on the tow rig was checked twice. Lou had already fueled the tank, tightened the winch line, and tested the remote throttle. We weren't just pulling a gate, we were pulling back every inch of control Karen had tried to seize from people around her. The only thing louder than the machine's engine that day would be the echo of that gate screeching off its stolen ground. I placed small orange cones along the property line, not for legal reasons. I already had those covered, but so the crowd gathering wouldn't get too close. Yes, a crowd. Word had spread faster than I anticipated. Neighbors came out with coffee cups in hand, pretending to water their lawns or check the mail, but it was obvious what they were really here for. Some were on my side, others were just there for the drama. One guy even brought a lawn chair and bag of popcorn, shaking his head with amusement. I didn't encourage them, but I didn't send them away either. Let them see what happens when people push too far and mess with the wrong person. The gate was about 20 feet wide and solid steel, way overbuilt for a neighborhood of pastel houses and mailboxes shaped like lighthouses. 2 thick posts anchored it into the ground, probably cemented in by some overpaid contractor Karen hired to make the community look upscale. What she didn't account for was that even the fanciest gate can't outlast physics. With the tow rig parked squarely on my side, winch cable pulled taut, and camera drone buzzing overhead, I gave Lou the nod. He revved the engine, and I tightened the remote line. Nothing happened for a second. Then came the creak. It was slow at first, like the groan of an old ship's hull under pressure. But then the creak turned into a snap, and the whole east post started tilting like a tree giving up in a storm. Karen burst from her house at the sound. She wasn't dressed for battle this time. Pajama pants, a floral robe, and hair pulled up like she'd just rolled out of a dream about becoming supreme ruler of Pinebrook. She screamed something incoherent and sprinted toward the fence, her fuzzy slippers flopping on the pavement like angry fish. "Stop that! Stop right now! You're destroying HOA property." I calmly pointed toward the freshly marked survey flags and called back, "That's not HOA property. That's my land. And that's my gate now." She looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. Her arms flailed as she tried to step over the cones, but one of the neighbors gently stepped in her way. "You might want to step back, Karen. That gate's not gonna stand much longer," he said with a grin. The next pull from the winch sent a jolt through the entire gate. The base of the post cracked with a dry, echoing crunch, and suddenly the bottom edge lifted clear off the ground. The hinges shrieked. The gate twisted, bent at the middle like it was bowing in shame, and then it gave up altogether. The metal tore loose with a violent snap and slammed into the grass, just inside my property line. Karen froze. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to reboot. She turned to her HOA lackey, Todd, the same guy who once issued a citation for a mailbox that was 2 inches taller than regulation, and hissed, "Call the police." "I already did," I said before Todd could fumble for his phone. "Actually, I called the sheriff. They'll be here any minute. They've got a report on file already. You remember, the one where you trespassed and authorized a tow on property you don't own." A few of the neighbors laughed, not out loud, but enough that Karen's ears probably caught it. Her face turned red, hands clenched, feet planted like a defiant toddler. "You're going to jail for this," she barked. "You can't just tear down neighborhood structures." "Funny," I said, walking toward her slowly. "Because you towed off a private camper from private property. That's actual theft. What I just did was reclaim illegally installed metal from land that doesn't belong to you." As if perfectly timed, a county sheriff's SUV pulled up with its lights flashing. Deputy Carson stepped out, the same officer who handled my complaint the second time. He was older, more seasoned, and clearly annoyed that his Sunday morning had turned into Pinebrook's main event. "What's going on now?" he asked, looking at the gate lying on the grass and Karen, who was practically vibrating with fury. "I removed an unauthorized structure from my land," I explained, handing him the updated parcel map, easement denial letter, and a USB stick with the drone footage of Karen directing the original tow. Also brought a notarized witness statement from the tow yard. She paid them in cash, signed as HOA president, and ordered removal of personal property. Karen jumped in, talking so fast her words collided. "He just destroyed HOA property. That's destruction of public infrastructure. That gate was on his land, ma'am," the deputy cut in. "According to these records, he's within his rights." Karen blinked like she hadn't understood the words. "What?" Deputy Carson walked around the scene, taking pictures, measuring distances, and reviewing my documents. Eventually, he looked up at Karen and said, "This matches our GIS records. And the HOA has no easement here. Looks like your gate was over the line." "But he didn't get a demolition permit," she snapped. "It's not a demolition. It's removal of obstruction from private land," he replied flatly. Karen's body slumped like the fight had drained from her. She staggered back toward her porch, muttering legal threats that barely sounded coherent. The crowd dispersed slowly, neighbors exchanging looks like they'd just watched a pay-per-view brawl they didn't realize was free. A few gave me thumbs up or mouthed "thank you." One neighbor handed me a cup of coffee and said, "About time someone stood up to her." Lou started packing up the tow rig while I stood beside the fallen gate, staring at it like it had just confessed all of Karen's sins. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. What I felt was satisfied. Because justice, when done right, isn't loud. It's heavy, methodical, and undeniable. Karen may have thought that gate made her powerful. But today, it lay bent, scratched, and unceremoniously dragged off land it had no right to be on. And as far as I was concerned, it was a perfect metaphor for her reign as Pinebrook's HOA queen. The gate had barely been off the ground for a full day before the fallout began. I thought maybe, just maybe, Karen would take her public defeat as a sign to back off and disappear quietly into her manicured yard. But that wasn't how she operated. Karen didn't lose. At least not without kicking, screaming, and dragging everyone down with her. Her response came swiftly. By Monday afternoon, a printed notice had been taped to every mailbox on the block, including mine, even though technically I wasn't part of the HOA. The letter was written in that overly formal language that tries to sound legal but comes off more like a tantrum dressed in a necktie. She accused me of vandalism, threatening behavior, and unauthorized demolition of neighborhood property. She cited fake codes, non-existent bylaws, and demanded a full community review of my land's status. She had clearly decided to treat this like an election, and I was her new campaign to destroy. But her real move came not from a flyer but from the shadows. That week, I got a visit from a man who looked like he had never seen dirt under his nails in his entire life. He introduced himself as Leonard Grimes, a private zoning consultant hired by the HOA to re-evaluate boundary classifications. I invited him to speak standing on the gravel outside my workshop. He didn't seem pleased with the dust. "I've been contracted to reassess the zoning boundaries that might impact your parcel," he said, trying to sound neutral. "Zoning hasn't changed in 40 years, I replied, arms crossed. "Well, in light of the recent, incident, the HOA is reviewing all adjacent land parcels. There may be an opportunity for annexation, depending on how the easement language is interpreted." I almost laughed. Annexation? Like I was some rogue province that Karen's regime was planning to reclaim? "There's no easement. I checked it myself, and the county clerk confirmed it." "You want to see the documentation?" I asked, already reaching for the folder I kept in my truck. "No, that won't be necessary. I'm just here to evaluate," he said, clearly unnerved by how prepared I was. "Then evaluate this," I said, pointing to the flag markers I'd installed along the border. "You see that line? Everything on my side of it is mine. And if anyone steps over it again, I won't be calling a tow truck, I'll be calling my lawyer." He gave me a polite nod that looked more like a retreat than a goodbye, and got back into his Lexus like the dirt itself offended him. I stood there for a moment, the ridiculousness of it all setting in. Karen had hired a zoning mercenary to try and steal my land with paperwork, and I had no doubt she was already stirring her HOA pot, feeding them rumors about how I was a threat to the safety and order of their neighborhood. But I wasn't interested in just defending myself anymore. I was ready to go public. I contacted the local news outlet, a community station that usually covered ribbon cuttings and bake sales, and told them everything. I showed them the footage of the tow, the legal boundary documents, the drone video of the gate removal, and even copies of Karen's flyers. The reporter was practically salivating. It wasn't every day they got a story about an HOA president overstepping so far she ended up on someone else's lawn, literally and legally. The story aired 2 days later under the title, "HOA Overreach Sparks Backyard Battle. Resident Takes Justice into His Own Hands." The footage was clear, the timeline damning, and the public reaction swift. I wasn't just some angry guy with a grudge anymore. I was a symbol. A warning to overzealous HOAs and a hero to people tired of being told their mailbox paint wasn't regulation beige. The community forum lit up with comments. Some sided with Karen, naturally, people who couldn't imagine a world where someone dared challenge the sacred order of pine needle-free sidewalk. But most were on my side. And what really turned the tide was when several residents of Pinebrook, including some former HOA board members, started sharing their own stories. Turns out I wasn't the first person Karen had targeted. She'd fined an elderly couple for using wind chimes that caused auditory pollution, and tried to evict a tenant for hanging a pride flag on their porch. She was, as one comment read, a tyrant in a tennis visor. The fallout came faster than she expected. A petition began circulating to hold a recall vote for her position as HOA president. At first, I stayed out of it. I didn't want to be accused of leading a witch hunt. But when a local woman named Janice, a soft-spoken school librarian who lived 3 doors down from Karen, knocked on my door and thanked me for finally standing up to the HOA dictator, I realized something bigger was at play. People had been afraid of Karen for years. She didn't enforce rules, she weaponized them. And now, for the first time, she was on the receiving end. So I started talking. Not loudly, not angrily, just honestly. I shared what happened at community meetings, I posted the legal documents online, and I encouraged anyone who'd ever been wrongly fined, cited, or intimidated to come forward. And they did. One by one, stories came out like floodwaters behind a broken dam. Karen's carefully constructed kingdom of compliance was collapsing under its own arrogance. But she wasn't finished yet. Her final move came in the form of a police report. I found out about it when Deputy Carson returned to my property, this time with a copy of the complaint Karen had filed against me. She accused me of threatening her, of harassment, and, most bizarrely, of preparing military-style equipment to intimidate homeowners. Apparently, the winch rig I'd used to remove the gate was now being painted as a weapon. Carson looked as tired of her nonsense as I was. He sat me down and said, "Look, we're required to investigate, but honestly this looks more like retaliation than any real complaint." I nodded. "She's losing control. She's panicking. We've reviewed the footage and interviewed the tow yard staff. It's all there. She had no right to remove your camper, and the gate was on your land. But we still need to close this officially. You mind if we take another look at your footage?" I handed over the latest SD card, this one showing Karen sneaking back onto my property at night with a flashlight and what looked like bolt cutters. She'd tried to cut down the camera sign I'd posted near the gate markers. Carson watched the clip and sighed. "Well, I think that's about all we need." The following day, Karen was arrested for filing a false police report and for trespassing. It wasn't a dramatic takedown. No sirens or handcuffs on the lawn. Just a quiet knock on her door and a polite but firm escort to the squad car. The image of her being driven away in silence felt more powerful than any words I could have said. By the end of the week, the HOA board had called an emergency session. The vote to remove Karen passed with 87%. Her resignation letter was short and bitter. She claimed the community had turned on her and that civility was no longer appreciated. What she meant was that her version of civility, domination by passive-aggressive memos and absurd fines, was finally over. Her house went up for sale within days, listed with no mention of prestigious HOA leadership or neighborhood harmony. Just square footage and a vague note about quiet neighbors. And the irony was, Pinebrook really did become quieter without her. For the first time in years, people were hosting porch dinners, talking across driveways, laughing without checking to see if someone was filing a complaint. And I, the man with the camper and the tow rig, stood in the middle of it all, not as a villain, not as an outsider, but as the guy who drew a line and dared anyone to cross it. The day Karen's moving truck rolled out of Pinebrook felt like the neighborhood had finally taken a deep breath. It wasn't dramatic. There were no farewell speeches or lingering waves from her porch. Just the sound of boxes being loaded, a for sale sign swinging slightly in the breeze, and the silent relief of a community that no longer had to pretend her reign was noble. Her departure wasn't marked by applause or banners. It was marked by something better, peace. The kind of peace you don't realize you're missing until the tyrant with the clipboard is gone. I stood on my front porch with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the truck disappear down the street, and for the first time since the camper incident, I let myself relax. But even with Karen gone, the mess she'd left behind wasn't finished with me. There were still meetings to attend, cleanup to handle, and one important task left undone: the restoration of my camper. When I'd gotten it back from the tow yard, it had been mostly intact, but there were cosmetic scrapes, a bent stabilizer jack, and a small gash on the side where the cable had hooked wrong. It wasn't ruined, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Not yet. So I called Lou, told him to bring his tool chest, and we got to work. We replaced the jack, hammered out the dent, and gave it a full polish. He brought new LED lighting strips to replace the ones that had been cracked, and I installed fresh curtains made from the same fabric my grandmother had used in the original. I even added a new decal to the back, silver cursive letters that read "Boundary Breaker." It wasn't just a camper anymore. It had become a monument to standing your ground, to fighting back when someone tries to take what's yours with a smile and a forged signature. Once it was done, I parked it in the same place it had been before this entire saga began, this time with a full set of concrete footings, a privacy fence around it, and a camera mounted overhead. Not for paranoia, just for assurance. People knew now. They understood. My property was not to be touched. Not long after the dust settled, I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't from Karen, thankfully, but from the new HOA president, a man named Eugene Halpern. He introduced himself as someone hoping to mend what's been frayed, and requested a meeting. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let them stew in the aftermath of their own drama, but curiosity got the better of me. So I agreed to meet him on neutral ground, at a small coffee shop just outside the neighborhood's edge. Eugene turned out to be the exact opposite of Karen. Where she had weaponized her authority like a drill sergeant, he spoke with a nervous politeness that made it hard to dislike him. He ordered chamomile tea. That alone told me this man was not planning a hostile takeover. I wanted to apologize on behalf of the board, he said, pushing a folder across the table. Everything Karen did, the towing, the gate construction, the false report, we don't condone any of it. She acted alone, and frankly, she misled a lot of people. I opened the folder. Inside were notarized letters from multiple HOA members disavowing Karen's actions, along with a formal statement of apology. They'd even attached a reimbursement check for the minor damages to the camper, along with a signed agreement that confirmed Pinebrook would never attempt to impose jurisdiction on my land again. That's all appreciated, I said, scanning the pages, but why now? He folded his hands. Because Karen didn't just make enemies. She made a mess of everything, legal boundaries, community trust, even finances. We're trying to reset, and your story kind of galvanized things. People want change. They want transparency. And honestly, they want peace. That, at least, I could respect. I nodded, signed the document, and shook his hand. We weren't going to be friends, but we could be neighbors. At a distance, on clear terms, with no gates or clipboards involved. He offered one final idea, a small gesture he hoped would help bridge the past. There's a vacant lot at the edge of the neighborhood. Used to be common space, but the board voted to turn it into something useful. Would you be open to helping us design a community garden? Something for everyone. No politics. Just tomatoes and zucchini. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but I appreciated the effort. Only if it doesn't touch my property line, I said with a smirk. Fair, he replied. That garden became a small but meaningful symbol of what Pinebrook could be without Karen's grip. Residents who hadn't spoken in years began sharing tools, compost, and recipes. Kids planted sunflowers, and retired couples swapped tips about soil pH. No one talked about bylaws or citations. They just got their hands dirty and grew something. I kept my distance, but I dropped by sometimes with extra seeds or tips from my granddad's old gardening notes. One woman offered to make a plaque that read, "In honor of the boundary breaker," but I politely declined. I didn't want a title. I just wanted my land respected and my peace restored. Months passed, and life slowly settled into something that resembled normal. The neighbors waved more. The board meetings became quieter. And the HOA newsletter shifted from passive-aggressive memos to actual community updates. Karen's name faded from the conversation, only mentioned now and then when someone recalled how far things had gone before they finally snapped back into place. One Saturday morning, as I was cleaning the camper's windows, a car I didn't recognize pulled up along the road. Out stepped a man with a badge clipped to his belt. For a brief second, my heart skipped. But he walked calmly, hands visible, no tension in his posture. "Jake Monroe?" he asked. "Yeah, that's me. I'm with the county's code enforcement office. Just following up on a report from earlier this year. Karen Dillingham had filed several zoning complaints before she was removed. We're closing those now, but we wanted to make sure nothing else needs addressing." I smiled. "Nope. Everything's been addressed. Lines are marked, documents filed, and as far as I know, the only thing out of place was a gate I already took care of." He chuckled, nodded, and made a note on his tablet. You're kind of a local legend, you know. Not something I aimed for, I replied, wiping down the last pane of glass. Well, sometimes legends don't aim. They just stand their ground. As he left, I looked out at the fence line. The grass had grown back over the spot where the gate had stood. You couldn't even see the scar anymore. But I knew it was there. I remembered every creak of the winch, every scream from Karen, every quiet cheer from neighbors too scared to speak before. That ground had been fought for, not with fists or shouting, but with facts, calm resistance, and unshakable resolve. And I knew, deep down, that if it ever happened again, if anyone ever tried to push me out of what was mine, I wouldn't hesitate. I'd hook up that rig, plant my boots, and pull until justice was loud enough for the whole block to hear. Because in a world where people like Karen build gates to control others, sometimes it takes a stubborn neighbor with a tow hook and a backbone to remind everyone where the real lines are drawn. And sometimes, just sometimes, the best way to stop a bully is to tow their nonsense right off its hinges.